Hi all, Lane here from my dining room table. I hope you're all doing well this week. I hope you had a good one. Um, we are doing fine here still, and unfortunately, it looks like this is going to continue to be the new norm. Nothing's changed with the government, and it seems to be really, even for our county, that the most vulnerable times we have are in the next coming weeks. So we'll continue to reach out by video every week. We have some plans moving ahead for that. I hope also that if anybody has any needs financially as things get maybe worse, that you would please reach out. We do have funds set aside, ready to go, at least some to help. So please be forthright with any needs of you or your family or friends or those that you think we might be able to help. Being that this is also the new norm and Easter and Passover is upon us, I don't want to just let those go. I want to still celebrate those. They are holidays that are meant to be celebrated no matter what happens in this world. They have been celebrated since their inception. It doesn't matter if it's sickness or war or famine. People, families in their homes are meant to still celebrate this. Even though I can't have you to my table to experience this tonight, I can't be in Bloxburg at the town hall sharing this with you. We still want to partake in this together as much as we can, and technology will allow us to do that, at least to a certain degree. So what you see here today is some of the makings and trappings of a Passover meal, and I'm going to take us through that today. Now you might say, why Passover? Isn't this Easter time? This is a Jewish holiday, isn't it? Yes, and right out the bat, I do want to be sensitive to those that may be listening that are Jewish or know a bit about this or might be offended. And no, I'm not Jewish, but there is a link, a distinct link between Christianity and Passover, and that connector is Jesus. And we're going to find out about that tonight. Now, today, or actually in the coming days, we celebrate Palm Sunday. That is when we remember when Jesus went to Jerusalem. He's entering the city, and people are pulling palms off of palm trees and waving them and putting their coats on the ground as they believe the Messianic King has arrived, coming to Jerusalem to make his statement, to come and take his throne. Now, the next Sunday, we celebrate as Easter, when he resurrects from the dead, conquering Satan, sin, and death, our great enemies. Now, if you hit pause right there, there's kind of seeming to be a missing chapter. What about the in-between? Like he comes in to grab his kingdom and then he's coming back from dead. How did he die? Well, is there any commemoration of what he did there? And yes, there is. It's called Good Friday. On Friday, he was crucified. And it seems strange maybe that the most terrible thing in human history, the scandalous murder of the perfectly innocent Son of God, is called Good Friday. That is a strange thing that we would call it good, but we call it Good Friday because he dealt with our sin on that day. He took on its weight and its due justice and wrath from God. And he enabled us, he bought us eternal life that day when he dealt with it. Now, what does Good Friday have to do with Passover? Passover just so happened to be celebrated on that same Friday that Jesus was crucified. Now, it being a big time celebration, the Jewish people and God really knew how to party. They would do week-long, sometimes even longer celebrations, taking time off work, and they would feast sometimes for just days and days and days. Passover, it also was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It would start the week before. I don't know the exact amount of days, but it was a big build-up, and then on Friday they would do the big Passover meal. And what the connection is between not just the coincidence of them being on the same day, Passover and Good Friday, but think back to the night before when Jesus was betrayed, when he had, as history calls it, the Last Supper, and with his disciples, right? And he had the wine and the bread, and he broke the bread and said, "Do this in remembrance of me," and passed it out. And that's when the Christian sacrament of communion was created and installed by Jesus himself. Well, it just so happens that that Last Supper was actually the Passover meal itself. Jesus was leading his disciples through that sacred Jewish holiday meal. So, what is going on there? We want to spend the rest of our time figuring out what Jesus said about the Passover. He inserts himself into the meal and says that it actually is about him. And then as we go through it, I'm going to point some of those things out. And then I'm also going to interpret a little bit more now that Jesus has died and rose again. And now we have the New Testament scriptures that we can then place on the Old Testament scriptures and make it one big unified story and see how it all connects. And I'm going to add some of that into it as well. Now, the Passover meal, it's a big celebration. It takes a lot of time to go through it. It's a great time that we do every year now because it's become so beautiful to us. I'm going to do it pretty briefly. I'm just going to run through the main points just so you can get a sense of how cool this is. And maybe next Friday, you guys can do it yourselves. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can do it clunky. The Lord loves when people look into his scriptures, look into his story, look at his son, and want to worship him in new, beautiful, biblically centered ways. As I said, when I discovered this, when my family discovered this, as my friends have discovered this, it's one of the most beautiful, deep, rich things I have found in all of the scriptures. It still blows my mind that this can even be true. It's miraculous. So, like I said, my family and I celebrate it every year, and we will celebrate it looks like just with our family this year. So, why don't we jump in to what Passover is. I have what's called the Haggadah or Haggadah. I'm going to butcher all of the Jewish words that are in here. I've got a really good friend, Steve Schlurf, who actually he's learned some Hebrew, and he'll say some Hebrew prayers, and he does a great job. I just butcher it with my Englishness, but we're still going to give it a shot. So what they would do, families would get together. If there were some folks that didn't have lambs, we're going to find out lambs are necessary, then sometimes half a neighborhood might get together, and the patriarch of the home, maybe it's the father or the grandfather, he would get his Haggadah, which basically had all the blessings and prayers and teachings that would take the group, the family, the community through this beautiful, ritualistic, ceremonial holiday where they got to eat together. Now, where did this Passover come from? What are they even celebrating? Well, you can find the story in the book of Exodus. At that time, the people of Israel, God's people, were enslaved to a Pharaoh in Egypt. They were there for 400 years, and they had a good relationship there to start. It was wonderful. But then over the years, it got worse and worse and worse, and they grew and grew and grew to over 1 million people. And the new Pharaoh saw an opportunity to take advantage, and he enslaved them, and soon it became bitter slavery, terrible, oppressive, and the people of Israel cried out to God, and God answered them to come rescue them through the hand of Moses, who I'm sure you've heard of, and Aaron. And what he did through them is he spoke through them or gave them words to say to Pharaoh, and he also did these incredible miracles, which came in the form of plagues, to the people of Egypt in front of Pharaoh. And Moses and Aaron warned Pharaoh first, hey, this is what's going to happen if you don't let my people go. If you've heard that term before, let my people go. And Pharaoh was so infamously hard-hearted. If you've seen the movie back in the day, Ben-Hur, it took 10 plagues for Pharaoh to finally break. And it was actually the 10th plague, the terrible 10th plague, that finally broke his will. And that 10th plague was God spoke through Moses and told Pharaoh, if you don't let my people go, I'm to the point now where an angel of death will go through all this region, including the people of Israel, them as well, and this angel of death and judgment will kill the firstborn of every household. Now, because this was a terrible judgment, a terrible death, trying to pry the people of Israel free from Pharaoh, God gave those that would listen a way out. He said, if you take a lamb and you sacrifice this lamb, and you take the blood of the lamb and put it on your doorposts and your lintel, the angel of death and judgment will come by. It'll see that sacrifice, that blood that was shed for you, and he will pass over your house, and your firstborn will be spared. Hence the name Passover. And this was such a huge historical moment for Israel, because Pharaoh finally did let Israel go free, and after this they became a great nation. It is looked upon as it is the genesis of the Israelites as a nation. This is their birthplace, is this time in Egypt when God freed them with his mighty right hand and outstretched arm, as it says throughout the scriptures. So that's where the holiday comes from, and it was such a big deal that God says, you are going to celebrate Passover every single year. Now, one of the other parts and where the meal comes from is that as this angel of death was going through the streets, by house to house to house, for those that were being covered by the blood of the lamb, God said, while this is happening, I want you to take this lamb and roast it over fire and eat it and share it with your family and friends if needed. And there's going to be some other symbolic foods for you to eat, such as unleavened bread. You don't have time for it to rise. You need to eat your meal with your sandals on and your belt tightened, staff ready, because your liberation is at hand. So that's where the meal part comes from. And over the years, there has been what's created the Seder meal, and also the Seder plate. And that's what we have here. And there's these elements of the Seder plate that create a portrait of Israel's redemption. And as Jesus transposes onto it and our understanding of it, we now say that it wasn't just Israel's liberation from sin, but it's our liberation from sin. Not just their liberation from slavery, but our liberation from sin. So, how did this work? What did they do? How did they get it started? Well, it began first with a candle being lit. Or at least some folks did it this way. A woman from every household would light the candle and so kindle the festival light, start the festival. Yeah? And as Christians, we see this as a reminder of God's promise that a Messiah, the light of the world, would come from the seed of a woman. Awesome. Then glasses would be raised. Yes, wine was involved, or juice for the children, or for those that didn't want to partake with wine. And the patriarch would give this first traditional blessing. He would say, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, who has created the fruit of the vine. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, who has sustained us and enabled us to reach this season." And they would drink. And there was 4 cups, and you would fill your cup, and you're supposed to drink the cup all the way down on every blessing. So you got to watch how much you pour. After the opening of the meal, a bowl of water. I have here, you can't see the water, but a bowl of water and a towel was given to each person individually, and they dipped their hands into the water to wash ceremonially, to show to God, like as a token, their heart to want to serve him acceptably, right? And if you think back, and now I'm going to tie in Jesus a bit here, if you think back to that night of the Last Supper, he went around and took this to a deeper level. He went around and he got on his knees, he disrobed, wrapped around his waist, and he washed the disciples' dirty, gnarly feet. They walked around in those streets in sandals. You know what was in those streets? And Jesus, he bent down and he washed all 12 of their feet, showing us graciously what true service is. It starts with motivation of humility and love for his guys. Then, after that, everybody would be directed, their attention would be directed towards the Seder plate, and they would go through each of the symbolic elements and they would partake. Now, these aren't necessarily, wasn't to like eat. This wasn't the feast portion. This was the symbolic portion. So what I'm going to do is go through each one of these to explain what they meant, what it reminded them of, and also what it now can show us about our reality. Yeah? So the first was the karpas, and karpas, I don't know if that's how they say it, Karpas, karpas, or greens to remind us of life. And that's this one here. And they would be dipped in salt water. And the salt water was to represent tears, to show that any type of life without redemption is a life of sadness and of pain. And they would eat that. Next was the chazareth, the root of the bitter herb. And here we have some radish for that. And it is to remind us of the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. And for us, the greater bitterness of slavery to our sin. Sin as an oppressor, and you'd eat the radish. Next was the maror, which is the bitter herbs. We have parsley here. And that is to remind us of the tears of the Israelites that they shed as slaves. And some folks would use horseradish for this. And if you're brave enough, you would eat the horseradish enough until it made you tear up to really get into the mood of this. Just the charoset, that's this here, and we're using hummus. It was supposed to be anything brown and pasty, or sometimes it was a mix of apples and nuts, something red or brownish in color, and it was to be used to show the mortar, to remind us of the mortar that the Israelites made to make the bricks for the Egyptians, and how tough it was to make that. You partake of that. And then there was the haggadah, which is our egg here, and this one has a little bit of fogginess as its historical background. What it's looked upon now as is the morning sacrifices at the future temple. So at this point, the temple wasn't made, but it would be made. And the people of Israel, they loved their temple and their way of sacrifices. And so that's what the egg represents. But because the temple was destroyed in AD 70 by Rome, it was then dipped in the salt water to again represent tears before it was eaten. Next and finally, we have the zoroa, or the shank bone of the lamb here. And I didn't roast a lamb tonight. Might do that next week. I just have some meat there, some that was roasted over the fire, and it's supposed to represent the Passover lamb that's sacrificed for us. Now, cool part here, major cool link, is that most people these days don't have lambs running around in the backyard, so they go out and they purchase a leg of lamb, a big leg of lamb. But what they have to say, and if you go to Eureka Natural Foods here, if you say, I need a leg of lamb for Passover, they immediately know what you need. It's something different. There's no sawing or breaking of the bone. It's prepared in a specific way. And that is because back in Exodus, when God said, you're going to eat this lamb that was sacrificed for you, it was supposed to be unblemished. And so he didn't want any bones broken in the lamb. And then there's another link to the Messiah, because in the Psalms it says that none of the Messiah's bones would be broken. They'd be protected. And then go a step further to Jesus. When he was on the cross being sacrificed, the way that you died on the cross was through asphyxiation. When you finally ran out of strength in your legs and you slumped down, the pressure and weight would crush your lungs and you would suffocate and asphyxiate. And so because the Sabbath was coming and the priests wanted this to be done so they could get on with their meals, they sent the soldiers to break the legs of those on the cross. There was the two thieves and there was Jesus in the middle. And they went to the two thieves and they broke their legs to hasten their death. And when they went to Jesus to break his legs, they stopped. It was because they found he was already dead. And they took a spear and they pierced him in the side just to make sure. But he was gone. And so Jesus's body was protected in that way. He was a pure, unadulterated sacrifice. His bones weren't broken. Finally, there would be unleavened bread, and that's in here, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Unleavened bread was passed around, and it was one of the central pieces to the Passover meal. It's flat because the Israelites didn't have time to put leaven in the dough to make it rise. Like I said, they were to eat it in haste because their liberation was at hand. Also, as you read on in the scriptures, leaven represented sin. And so, as there was supposed to be no leaven in the bread, during the workup of the week through their festival, they would clean out all of the leaven in their house, kind of like a ritualistic cleansing. Get rid of all of the sin, all of the leaven in the house. Interesting, right? Now check this scripture out, written by Paul. This is years after Jesus was crucified and resurrected. And listen to the verbiage he uses for leaven and Passover and sacrifice and Jesus. He says this in 1 Corinthians, "Purge therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. For even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice or wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." Man, how deep and lovely is that connection to Passover. At this very important part of the Seder, the unity was brought forth, and that's what this is. It was a three-layered compartment, and there's ones you can buy. I just took this pouch here that was actually given to me by a good friend, and I put some cloth in there, and I separated it into three compartments, and I put a layer of matzo in each one. Okay? Now, traditionally there was always a little confusion as what the unity was or why they included it. Some said it was the unity of worship, referring to the order of priests. Others said it was the unity of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I think, and I hope, as you see how the tradition goes, that you can see a deeper meaning. The leader would take out the middle piece of matzo, and he would break it. And then he would take some linen and he'd wrap it. And then he would hide this somewhere, probably away, dark, concealed, for a later time. 2,000 years ago, while thousands and thousands of people broke their matzo bread, wrapped it, and then hid it away, Jesus' broken body was taken from the cross, wrapped in linen, and buried in the dark. We'll come back to that later, as they would in the traditional meal. After this, the story of the Israelites in Egypt would be told, and when it came to the part of the 10 plagues, each plague would be stated, and simultaneously every person would take their glass of wine, and when someone said a plague, they would take their finger and dip it in their wine, and then they would drop it into a saucer or another cup. So there was 10 plagues. So as it was, each one was stated, that's 10 drops that would go into that glass. Now, nobody would drink that glass, and for an important reason. It was called the cup of wrath. It was the cup of God's wrath that Israel didn't have to drink. Now, let's make another connection to Jesus. If you can remember, after he had the Passover meal with his disciples, he went out to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, right? And he sat down and he prayed to the Father. And if you remember his words, he prayed, "Father, I pray that this cup would pass from me, that I wouldn't have to take it. But Father, your will be done, not mine." Now, he didn't tell me this, but because it's right after Passover, he's speaking about the cup. He's speaking about the cup of God's wrath. I believe, and most believe, he was speaking about the cup of wrath. And God loved us so much that he did send his son to drink it. And he drank it down to the dregs, every last drop. But us, and those who partake of this meal, they don't drink that cup. Instead, the next cup that you would drink in this ceremony was the cup of praise. They'd raise their glasses and they'd say, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, creator of the fruit of the vine. We praise you for the plagues that though they brought suffering, we're not happy about that, but they brought our deliverance that followed." At this point, they would take a break. They would break from the ceremony and commence the feasting. Dishes were all brought out to be shared. Often they're cultural, dependent on location. They would be kosher, of course. But if you lived in Ukraine or in South America, there would be, of course, the Passover meal looks different and lovely depending on where you're taking it. All is welcome. And they would feast with thankfulness because their God had saved them. And they have this tradition and this heritage. They'd share it together and eat and drink until their fill. And when everybody was ready, they'd come back and settle in to finish the meal. To finish the final stretch of the meal, a game would be played with the kids. So what the leader would say is, go and find what is now called that matzo wrapped in linen. It has a name. It's called the afikomen. He'd say, go find the afikomen. And whoever found it would get a prize, or even like a good prize. Like I'd give $20 sometimes to a kid. It's supposed to be like a crazy cool gift. So the matzo would be presented to the leader, who would then unwrap it. Let's go get it. He would unwrap it. And he would present it to everybody, and then he would break it for everyone. And he would pass it around to his guests, and everybody would partake of the same piece of bread. We got to stop here, right? I think you can probably see what's going on here, can't you? But I'm going to read here from C.L. and Moishi Rosen's book, Christ and the Passover. It's a great book. It goes through all the history, tradition of the Jewish Passover and its connection to Christ. They were Orthodox Jews, and they became believers in Jesus as the Messiah, and they actually are the founders of Jews for Jesus, if you've heard of that. And this is what Moishi wrote concerning both the unity and this afikomen that we find. All right, I'm going to read a bit here. Listen to this. We see then in the 3 pieces of matzo on the Passover table a truth that remains hidden from most of the Jewish community to this day. That the truth of the unique unity of the eternal God is expressed in the Shema, the most widely spoken utterance of faith in all of Judaism, found in Deuteronomy 6:4. Quote, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." In the original Hebrew, the word for one is echad, meaning a composite oneness, rather than the absolute number one. This same word, echad, appears in Genesis 2:24 to signify that Adam and Eve became one flesh. The 3 pieces of matzo then depict the eternal unity of God, the ineffable name who appeared to Moses in the burning bush, the Messiah, the son of David, who became flesh that was broken to effect absolute redemption for the entire human race, and the Holy Spirit who guides and directs and empowers the redeemed of the Lord. At the Seder, we single out the middle matzo representing the Messiah, even as he was foreordained to die for the sins of the world. We break the middle matzo, signifying his death, for he was crucified, even as the psalmists and the prophets foretold. We hide the middle matzo, signifying burial, just before the 3rd cup of wine, perhaps symbolizing 3 days. We resurrect the middle matzo, just as Jesus, the Messiah, rose from the grave in the fulfillment of Job 19:25 and 16:10 of Psalm. Then all the faithful partake of the middle matzo, signifying a personal, individual part in the everlasting redemption of God, even as Jesus himself taught. "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world." Well said. If you remember the famous words of the Last Supper, where it says he took bread and he broke it and he passed it around. And what did he say? "This is my body, broken for you." When you take matzo, it has some characteristics to it. It is a little bit scorched. It's got holes in it. It's pierced. And it's in a striped pattern. It's striped. If you read the most beautiful and incredible Old Testament prophecy of the Messiah, Isaiah 53, it speaks of the suffering servant, what he would do for us. And if you read that and you don't see Jesus, then you simply have a hard heart, as hard as Pharaoh's. In it, it says there that he was pierced for our transgressions, and by his stripes we are healed. There's so many deep connections of Jesus to Passover, the entire story of the Bible, one unified salvific arc. It's too much for a heart of faith to hear. It brims with the miraculous, the amazement that God could weave this all together. And they cannot be denied, these connections. Jesus is our Passover lamb. Finally, to conclude this beautiful meal, there was one more traditional cup of acceptance. We've been accepted for what Jesus has done, how Jesus did it, why he did it. We're now in. And then there was a kind of a ending raise of the glass, and they would all proclaim next year in Jerusalem as they looked to their city, their hope, their future. And for us as Christians, we look to the words of Christ, where he says this: "Behold, I am coming soon. My reward is with me, and I will give to everyone according to what they have done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright morning star. Maranatha, come, Lord Jesus. And so concludes the Passover meal. I hope this encourages you that, again, that through history you see God's care for you, that no matter, he has this long view that that no matter what people were going through, he would lift up and redeem people along the way. This salvation, it endures even during times such as ours. Celebrate Good Friday this week with a deeper sense of hope, of thankfulness, of knowing that your God will save you from every type of oppression, whether it comes from the outside in, as we've seen, or from the inside, ourselves. He is our great Savior who loves us. We'll see you next week for Easter. Bye.